Her home was destroyed by a racist gang, but what if she's hiding a secret weapon? Discover the astonishing reveal of a quiet community advocate who transforms into a Delta Force warrior in a fight for justice. You won't believe Calanthe Monroe awoke before dawn in a modest, well-kept house tucked away in a rundown neighborhood of Eastbridge, a city where every brick and every alley whispered stories of hardship and hope in equal measure. The early morning light filtered softly through stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors on the worn hardwood floors. Though the house appeared humble from the outside, it held an untold legacy that Calanthe herself guarded closely. In the quiet hours before the city stirred, she sat at her small kitchen table, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint memories of a past that few knew about. For Calanthe, the weight of her history was both a burden and a secret source of strength. Born into a world where injustice was a daily reality, she had learned from an early age to shield her heart behind a calm, resolute exterior. What few realized, however, was that she had once served as part of the elite Delta Force, a chapter of her life so fiercely kept that even her closest friends assumed her military background was a distant dream rather than a lived truth. Every scar, every memory of grueling training in covert operations, had forged in her a spirit capable of withstanding the cruelest of storms. That morning, as she reviewed a faded photograph of her unit tucked away in a battered journal, Calanthe recalled the discipline and camaraderie that had once defined her. The same unyielding focus that had carried her through years of conflict now imbued her with a quiet determination to protect those in her community. It was this inner strength that had drawn her to work as a community advocate in Eastbridge, a role that allowed her to fight battles of a different kind, to help the forgotten and the downtrodden reclaim their dignity. Yet, her dual life was about to collide in a way that would test the very limits of her resilience. Outside her home, the day was still dark and heavy with the promise of rain. The streets, though mostly empty at this hour, bore the silent testimony of a city that had known too many struggles, graffiti splattered on weathered walls, abandoned storefronts standing as relics of a bygone era, and the distant sound of sirens echoing through narrow alleys. Calanthe stepped out onto the front porch, her eyes scanning the horizon with a mix of caution and hope. She was aware that the neighborhood had been on edge lately, with rumors swirling about a vicious gang that had been targeting vulnerable communities with reckless cruelty. It was in that moment, as she locked the door behind her and began her morning walk through the neighborhood, that an inexplicable chill ran down her spine. The air, thick with humidity and the scent of distant rain, seemed to vibrate with a foreboding energy. Calanthe's senses, sharpened by years of covert training, detected subtle signs of disturbance, a broken window at a neighbor's house, a hastily scrawled message on a wall hinting at a violent plan. With a steady breath, she pushed forward, her resolve hardening as she mentally prepared herself for whatever lay ahead. Every step she took resonated with memories of her past missions and the unyielding courage that had once saved lives in the battlefield. Now, her mission was different. It was to safeguard her community, to stand as a bulwark against the tide of hatred that threatened to engulf everything she had built. Though she carried the burden of a painful past, Calanthe also carried an unspoken promise, to fight not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been overlooked, oppressed, or mistreated. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in hues of gold and lavender, Calanthe reached the corner of her street where neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes. In a gentle yet determined voice, she exchanged quiet greetings and offered subtle words of reassurance. Each smile she received was a small victory, a sign that even in a place marred by decay and neglect, hope still flickered. Yet beneath that veneer of community life, the specter of racial hatred and systemic neglect loomed large, ready to shatter lives without a second thought. By the time Calanthe returned to her home, the day had fully awakened, and the city buzzed with an energy that was both vibrant and volatile. Little did she know, that day would mark the beginning of a trial by fire, one that would not only force her to confront the raw edge of hatred but also reveal the hidden depths of her formidable strength. In the quiet solitude of her modest home, as she prepared for another day of advocacy and clandestine vigilance, Calanthe Monroe silently vowed that no act of cruelty would go unanswered. With every heartbeat echoing the lessons of her past, she was ready to step into the storm, to stand tall against the forces of racism, and to transform despair into an unwavering beacon of hope. Later that morning, as the pale light of dawn barely penetrated the smoky haze of a restless Eastbridge sky, Calanthe Monroe began her day unaware that the fragile peace of her neighborhood was about to shatter. She left her modest home with the quiet determination that had carried her through countless early mornings, her steps measured and resolute on the cracked pavement. The air was heavy with humidity, and the distant rumble of traffic mixed with the soft chirps of early birds. Yet, as she walked down the familiar streets, her heightened instincts, refined by years of covert training and experience, told her something was amiss. At the corner of her block, a low murmur of voices caught her attention. A group of men, whose features were twisted with malice and whose eyes burned with unchecked hate, congregated near an unoccupied storefront. Their conversation was terse and punctuated by angry gestures, though their words were inaudible to her, the tone was unmistakably hostile. Calanthe paused, her senses on high alert. She recognized that the unmistakable aura of a dangerous presence was gathering, a presence that was all too familiar in Eastbridge, a city where systemic hatred sometimes coiled itself around unsuspecting communities like a noose. Within minutes, the sound of revving engines sliced through the silence. A black SUV, its windows tinted and its engine growling like a predatory beast, screeched to a halt along her street. Calanthe's eyes narrowed as she saw more vehicles pull up, a procession of battered cars and trucks, their drivers grim and determined. The men from the corner moved swiftly, merging with the incoming crowd of attackers. Calanthe's heart pounded with a sudden, icy dread. She realized that this was no ordinary disturbance. These were men fueled by venomous hatred, a racist gang that had, time and again, targeted vulnerable communities with brutal force. Within moments, chaos erupted. Razor, the undisputed leader whose nickname was whispered with terror in hushed tones throughout the neighborhood, stepped forward. His presence was imposing, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down one side of his face, his eyes glinting with a mixture of cruelty and arrogance. He barked orders in a harsh, guttural voice, directing his cohorts with a precision that spoke of a lifetime spent orchestrating violence. The gang advanced with deliberate aggression, shattering the uneasy calm of the morning. Calanthe, still standing at the edge of her street, watched in horror as the attackers reached her home, a modest brick house that had been her sanctuary for years. With ruthless efficiency, they smashed through the front window, shattering glass like shards of ice that scattered across the sidewalk. The sound of breaking glass was followed by the roar of flames as a canister of gasoline was hurled onto the structure. Within seconds, the once warm home was transformed into a raging inferno, its windows aglow with an eerie, dancing red. The acrid smell of burning wood and plastic filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. For a brief, agonizing moment, time seemed to freeze. Calanthe's heart clenched as she watched memories of family dinners, quiet evenings spent with loved ones, and the modest joys of her humble life vanish in the blaze. Amid the chaos, she instinctively retreated into the shadows of a nearby alley, her training and discipline guiding her actions. Even as she felt the searing heat from the fire licking at the edges of her home, a deep, resolute determination surged within her. The racist gang's cruelty had not only reduced her sanctuary to ash but had also struck at the very core of her identity, a black woman who had long fought against systemic injustice, both on the battlefield and in her community. In that fraught moment, the attack became more than just an act of vandalism, it was a declaration of hatred, an attempt to break her spirit. As Calanthe crouched low behind a dumpster, she fought to control the rush of adrenaline and the rising tide of grief that threatened to overwhelm her. Memories of grueling Delta Force training flooded her mind, the countless hours spent learning to control every muscle, to breathe steadily under pressure, to transform raw emotion into focused power. With every beat of her heart, she silently vowed that she would not allow this act of hate to define her or her community. As the gang's jeers echoed in the distance and the roar of the burning house reached a fevered pitch, Calanthe steeled herself to act. With the resolve of someone who had faced down death in far more dangerous circumstances, she slipped out of the alley and began to move purposefully toward the epicenter of the destruction. Her footsteps were quiet but unwavering on the wet pavement, each step a silent promise that she would reclaim what had been taken from her. Amid the cacophony of sirens drawing near and the angry shouts of the perpetrators, Calanthy's mind raced with a single, burning question: how would she transform this profound loss into a catalyst for change? In that twilight of violence and despair, as the flames consumed the remnants of her home and the racist gang faded back into the obscurity of the city's underbelly, Calanthy Monroe embraced the darkness with unyielding resolve. The attack had shattered her world, but from those shattered fragments, she vowed to build a foundation of justice, unity, and unbreakable strength. And as the first responders began to tame the inferno and the neighborhood braced itself for the long road to recovery, Calanthy knew that her journey, from victim to avenger, from sorrow to empowerment, had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath of that horrifying night, as the flames finally died down and the acrid smoke gave way to a sorrowful silence, Calanthy Monroe found herself adrift in a whirlwind of shock, grief, and a burgeoning resolve. The next morning, the once familiar neighborhood of Eastbridge looked unrecognizable, charred remains of homes, shattered glass glistening like tears on the pavement, and a heavy cloud of despair that seemed to blanket every street. Calanthy woke before dawn, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and sorrow as she stared out the window of her temporary refuge. The remnants of her beloved home lay smoldering in the distance, a stark reminder that hatred had struck at the very core of her life. For hours, Calanthy sat in silence, the weight of loss nearly unbearable. Yet even in that darkness, fragments of her training as a Delta Force operator flickered at the edge of her consciousness, memories of rigorous drills, moments when she had learned to control her breath and focus her mind amid chaos. Determined not to succumb to despair, she resolved that this destruction would not mark the end of her fight, rather, it would be the catalyst for something greater. As the first responders began to cordon off the area and neighbors gathered in stunned clusters, Calanthy slipped out into the cool morning air, her eyes fixed on the smoldering ruins, and vowed that she would reclaim not only her home but also the dignity and safety of her community. In the days that followed, Eastbridge was engulfed in an outpouring of communal grief and outrage. News of the attack spread rapidly through local media, igniting protests and fervent calls for justice from community leaders and activists. Calanthy, who had always been a quiet pillar of support for her neighbors, suddenly found herself thrust into the spotlight. Some saw her as a victim, others as a potential catalyst for change, and a few, still blinded by prejudice, sought to dismiss her as another casualty of a troubled system. Yet amid this maelstrom of opinions, Calanthy remained resolute. She began working with sympathetic officers and civil rights advocates, sharing every piece of evidence she had managed to secure, grainy photos of the gang members, snippets of overheard threats, and even the remnants of the hateful graffiti left on her walls. Each document and each testimonial served as both a weapon against the forces of racism and a beacon of hope that the community could rise again. Late one rainy afternoon, as Calanthy met with a small group of community organizers in the back room of a local community center, she recounted every detail of the attack with clinical precision. Her voice, though low, carried an intensity born of years spent in covert operations, a controlled fury that resonated deeply with those who listened. "This is not just an attack on me," she said, her eyes burning with determination, "it is an assault on our entire community, on every person who has ever been marginalized and forgotten." Her words stirred something in the room. The organizers, many of whom had witnessed firsthand the scars of systemic racism, began to strategize. They planned peaceful protests, community vigils, and, most importantly, initiatives to rebuild not just homes, but the shattered sense of unity and hope that had long been suppressed by relentless discrimination. Even as the investigation unfolded and the police began to piece together the gang's network, Calanthy found moments of unexpected solace. Neighbors, initially paralyzed by fear, began to reach out, offering meals, assisting with cleanup efforts, and lending a sympathetic ear to her quiet resolve. In the midst of that collective healing, Calanthy's mind kept returning to her own secret, the skills honed during her years in Delta Force. Those memories, once buried under layers of civilian responsibility, now surged forth with newfound clarity. She spent long nights reviewing old training manuals and reconnecting with a few trusted former comrades, whose voices over crackling phone lines reminded her that she was still that formidable warrior, capable of standing up not only for herself but for the community that needed her. One particularly poignant evening, as the rain tapped softly against her temporary shelter's window, Calanthe sat with a group of local youth who had gathered to hear her speak. They listened, rapt and wide-eyed, as she described not only the horror of that fateful night but also the importance of resilience in the face of hatred. "We must not let their cruelty define us," she told them, her voice steady despite the pain. "Every act of hate is an invitation for us to rise above, to rebuild, and to fight for a future where no one's home is ever reduced to ashes." The words struck a chord with the young listeners, many of whom had known only struggle and survival. In that intimate circle, a spark was lit, a promise that, through unity and unwavering determination, even the darkest nights could lead to a dawn of change. As the weeks progressed, Calanthe's efforts began to bear fruit. A task force, led by both local law enforcement and community activists, managed to arrest several key members of the gang. Their capture sent shockwaves through Eastbridge, and for the first time in years, there was a tangible sense that justice might prevail. Meanwhile, Calanthe herself worked tirelessly, not just to seek retribution, but to spearhead a broader movement for community renewal. She organized neighborhood cleanups, initiated fundraising drives for rebuilding homes, and even established a small counseling program for victims of hate crimes, a testament to her belief that healing could only begin when every wound was acknowledged and treated with compassion. Through it all, the memory of that devastating night continued to haunt her, but it also served as a powerful reminder of why she fought. Each new day was a battle against both external forces of hatred and the internal scars of past trauma. Yet, with every small victory, every supportive word from a neighbor, every successful arrest, every home rebuilt, the darkness receded just a little further, making space for hope, unity, and renewal. By the time a fragile spring had fully taken hold, Eastbridge was beginning to transform. The once shattered community was knitting itself back together, and Calanthe Monroe, though forever changed by the scars of that terrible attack, emerged as a symbol of defiance and resilience. In the quiet aftermath of unspeakable cruelty, her journey of healing had set into motion a movement that promised not only to rebuild homes but to restore the shattered dignity of a community long marred by hate. And so, amid the soft patter of rain and the determined whispers of change, Calanthe prepared to step into the next phase of her journey, a journey that would challenge the forces of injustice and light the way to a future defined by courage, unity, and the unbreakable power of hope. That very night, after witnessing the horrifying destruction of her home, Calanthe retreated into the shadows of an abandoned alleyway, where she found refuge beneath a rusted fire escape. The glow of distant flames and the acrid smell of burning wood mingled with the chill of the early night air, and as she pressed herself against the cold, rough brick wall, memories of her covert training began to surface with startling clarity. Every drill, every lesson in restraint and precision that she had learned as a Delta Force operative pulsed through her mind like a steady heartbeat. In that moment of profound loss and searing grief, she vowed that the hateful act of the racist gang would not define her future. Instead, it would ignite within her a mission, one that would reclaim not only her life and dignity but also bring hope and justice to a community long oppressed by cruelty. For hours, Calanthe sat in that darkened alley, gathering her thoughts and mentally reviewing every aspect of her past training. She recalled the relentless physical regimens, the strategic maneuvers drilled into her by hardened instructors, and the calm determination that had once carried her through life-threatening situations. These memories, rather than filling her with despair, began to build an inner resolve, a quiet, unyielding determination to fight back against hate. Even as tears blurred her vision, she methodically examined the evidence she had managed to salvage from the scene, a broken window latch, a scrap of cloth from a gang member's uniform, and disturbing graffiti etched onto the ruined wall. Each fragment, no matter how small, was a clue in the puzzle of the perpetrator's identity and the systematic hatred that fueled their actions. Once the initial shock subsided, Calanthe moved stealthily through the labyrinthine backstreets of Eastbridge. Her steps were measured and silent, a testament to years spent perfecting the art of covert movement. Determined to avoid drawing any unwanted attention, she retraced her way to a safe house she had secured long before, a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the neighborhood that had become her secret sanctuary. There, in the dim glow of a single flickering lamp, she spread out the pieces of evidence on a rickety wooden table. With careful precision, she organized them, jotting down notes in a worn journal that had accompanied her through countless missions. The process was both cathartic and strategic. Each scrap of paper was a stepping stone towards unraveling the network of racism that had decimated her community. Calanthe then reached out to a select few trusted contacts, individuals she knew had also felt the sting of injustice and were committed to reclaiming their neighborhood. Under the cover of night, she arranged clandestine meetings in deserted parking lots and quiet corners of local diners. In hushed tones and with eyes that betrayed the gravity of the situation, these meetings became a crucible for forging a covert task force. Together, they discussed plans not for mindless revenge but for a calculated campaign aimed at dismantling the gang's operations. They strategized on ways to collect further evidence, planned to intercept communications among the perpetrators, and even outlined a system to work with sympathetic local law enforcement. Every detail was scrutinized, every potential risk weighed carefully against the promise of justice. As the hours passed and the first hints of dawn began to illuminate the skyline, Calanthe sat back and looked over the plans she had drawn, a sprawling map of Eastbridge marked with key locations, names, dates, and connections that seemed to form a tapestry of systemic hate. Despite the overwhelming weight of the task ahead, she felt an undeniable surge of purpose. The anger that had once threatened to consume her was now channeled into a clear mission, to expose the truth behind the gang's cruelty, to ensure that no other family in Eastbridge would suffer the same fate, and ultimately, to rebuild what had been destroyed. In that quiet early morning light, with the remnants of last night's rain still glistening on the pavement outside her safe house, Calanthe Monroe silently vowed to become the instrument of change that her community so desperately needed. The pain of loss would serve as the foundation for her resolve, and her years of elite training would be the means by which she brought hope and justice back to Eastbridge. With every meticulous plan and every whispered conversation in the shadows, she began to lay the groundwork for a revolution that promised to turn the tide against hatred and rebuild not only her home but the very spirit of a fractured community. In the days following that night of violent retribution, Calanthe Monroe's world shifted into a state of determined secrecy. The flames of her destroyed home had barely been extinguished when she realized that the path to justice required more than just raw emotion. It demanded a calculated, almost surgical approach. Each morning, as a pale sun struggled to pierce the smoky haze over Eastbridge, she emerged from her temporary refuge, a discreet safe house she had arranged with a trusted friend, to begin the meticulous work of gathering evidence. At first, Calanthe retraced the chaos of that fateful evening. Dressed in nondescript clothes and armed with a compact digital recorder and a small camera hidden in the lining of her jacket, she revisited the scene. Under the muted glow of streetlights, she documented every shattered window, every smear of gasoline still staining the concrete, and every tag of hateful graffiti scrawled on the remains of her home. Each detail was recorded with clinical precision, her mind focused on transforming the bitter sting of loss into the weapon of undeniable evidence. Her investigation soon extended beyond her immediate surroundings. Calanthe reached out quietly to a network of community members who had felt the sting of the gang's brutality. At a rundown barber's shop on a side street, she met with Malik, a soft-spoken young man whose eyes betrayed a lifetime of hardships. Over cups of strong black coffee served in chipped ceramic mugs, Malik recounted how he had once witnessed members of the gang terrorize a local business owner for refusing to pay protection money. His words, halting yet sincere, filled Calanthe's notebook with dates, descriptions, and the names of several low-level affiliates. Every piece of testimony, every whispered memory, wove a tapestry of organized hate that extended its reach well beyond her personal tragedy. Determined to leave no stone unturned, Calanthe sought the expertise of an old friend from her military days, a resourceful operative named Solomon Fairfax. Solomon had once been her second-in-command during covert operations and now worked in private security. Over a hushed phone call in a parking lot beneath a flickering street lamp, Solomon offered insights into the gang structure and hinted at a pattern in their movements. "They operate like a well-oiled machine," Solomon explained in a gravelly voice, "hitting neighborhoods where people are vulnerable, then disappearing into the underbelly of the city. You've got to be as precise as you are strong if you're going to take them down." Solomon's words reinforced Calanthy's resolve and inspired her to design a strategy that married her covert skills with community activism. With every new lead, Calanthy began to form a covert task force. Late one night in a secretive back room of the Eastbridge Community Center, its walls lined with faded photographs of a once thriving neighborhood, she gathered a small group of like-minded individuals. Among them were Malik, whose detailed accounts of the gang's operations were invaluable, Talia, a determined local journalist who had long covered hate crimes in the city, and a few sympathetic police officers who had grown frustrated with the systemic indifference toward racist violence. In that clandestine meeting, lit only by the low light of a single desk lamp and the quiet murmur of resolute voices, Calanthy laid out her plan. She distributed the evidence she had gathered, pointing to specific locations where the gang had previously struck, and explained the importance of coordinating their efforts to ensure that every criminal could be held accountable. The discussion was intense, each member contributing from their own experience and expertise. Talia pledged to bring the story to the public in a way that would galvanize community support, while the police officers agreed to monitor the gang's movements more closely. Malik, his voice trembling with both fear and determination, vowed to continue providing insider information, small, dangerous details that only someone on the ground could know. Calanthy listened to each pledge, her own voice calm yet imbued with the unyielding strength of her training. "We must document everything," she urged, "so that when we come forward, our evidence is irrefutable. This is not just about retribution, it's about reclaiming our community and ensuring that hate is exposed for what it is." For weeks, the task force operated under the cover of darkness. Calanthy, ever the silent sentinel, conducted nocturnal patrols along the scarred streets of Eastbridge, her every movement a dance of precision and vigilance. In those long, watchful hours, she would rendezvous with Malik in a secluded parking lot or slip into abandoned buildings to retrieve discarded items that might tie the gang to their heinous acts. Every small victory, whether it was a grainy video recording of a gang member boasting about their exploits or a freshly defaced wall bearing their insignia, was meticulously logged and compiled into a growing dossier that painted a damning portrait of organized hate. During one particularly fraught night, as a storm raged overhead and lightning illuminated the battered facades of Eastbridge's older buildings, Calanthy narrowly avoided detection while shadowing a suspected gang meeting. Hidden beneath a rusted overhang, she recorded every whispered command and noted the faces of those who conspired in the dark. The adrenaline was palpable, yet amidst the chaos, she felt a deep, unwavering certainty that every dangerous risk was a step toward justice. That night, as the rain washed away the soot and despair from the city streets, Calanthy's dossier grew more robust, a tangible testament to the strength and resilience of a woman determined to bring down hate with the precision of a warrior. By the time the storm subsided and the first hints of dawn began to break through the clouds, Calanthy returned to her safe house with a mind buzzing with plans and a heart steeled by resolve. In the solitude of that battered room, she reviewed the evidence once more, her eyes scanning each document, each photograph, and each snippet of overheard conversation. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture, a picture that exposed not only the individual crimes of a racist gang but also the systemic neglect that allowed such hatred to flourish unchecked. With a final, decisive stroke of her pen, Calanthy added the last note to her journal for that night: "We are gathering the truth, and soon, we will reclaim our home." In that moment, surrounded by evidence and the quiet solidarity of those who had joined her cause, Calanthy Monroe knew that the battle was far from over. Yet she also knew that the darkest nights were the precursors to the brightest dawns. Every drop of rain, every stolen moment of courage, was paving the way for a future where justice and compassion could triumph over cruelty. And so, as she prepared to rest, her mind filled with plans for the next phase of her mission, Calanthe embraced the realization that her fight was not just for herself, but for every soul in Eastbridge who had ever been silenced by hate. Under the cloak of darkness on a particularly stormy night, Calanthe Monroe moved like a shadow along the deserted industrial park on the outskirts of Eastbridge. The abandoned warehouses, with their rusted metal and broken windows, served as a grim backdrop to the nefarious activities of the racist gang that had tormented her community. Every step she took was measured and silent, a testament to the covert training of her Delta Force days. Tonight, her mission was clear: infiltrate the gang's meeting place, gather the crucial evidence needed to dismantle their network, and, if necessary, confront the perpetrators directly. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the cracked pavement into a mirror of the swirling tempest above. Calanthe's dark eyes, sharp as ever, flicked between the shadowy figures gathering near a graffiti-tagged warehouse door and the flickering neon sign that barely managed to illuminate the entryway. The air was thick with tension and the acrid smell of oil and wet concrete, and every sound, the drip of water from a corroded pipe, the distant rumble of thunder, seemed amplified in the silence of the night. As she approached the entrance, Calanthe paused behind a stack of discarded crates to observe the scene. A small group of men had already congregated inside the warehouse. Their voices, low and menacing, carried through the open doorway. She could hear snatches of conversation, boasts of past exploits, crude remarks about their targets, and the unmistakable cadence of organized malice. Among them, Razor, the notorious leader with a scar etched down one side of his face, spoke with authority, his words laced with venom and cruelty. Calanthe's heart pounded steadily, not with fear but with a cold, precise determination. Every fiber of her being was primed for what was to come. With a deep, steadying breath, Calanthe adjusted the strap of her hidden holster and stepped forward into the murky light. The gang members froze momentarily as she emerged from the darkness, her presence both unexpected and undeniably formidable. Razor's eyes narrowed as he sneered, "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Unfazed, Calanthe replied in a tone that was both calm and cutting, "I'm the reckoning you never saw coming." Her words, sharp as a blade, hung in the air as a tense silence fell over the group. In that charged moment, the dynamics shifted dramatically. Razor lunged forward, and what followed was a blur of movement, Calanthe's Delta Force training unleashed in a controlled storm of calculated strikes and defensive maneuvers. Every punch, every expertly delivered kick, was a testament to years of rigorous discipline. The gang, caught entirely off guard by her speed and precision, scrambled in disarray. One of the younger members attempted to charge her, only to be met with a swift, decisive counter that sent him sprawling. Razor, his bravado dissolving into shock, tried to rally his men, but the force of Calanthe's assault left little room for hesitation. Amid the chaos, Calanthe moved with a grace that belied the brutal efficiency of her strikes. She disabled opponents with non-lethal precision, ensuring that her actions were measured and focused on incapacitation rather than indiscriminate violence. Throughout the skirmish, her mind was a battleground of strategy and memory, the echo of her commanding instructors, the weight of every lesson in restraint, and the unyielding commitment to protect her community. Her eyes, fierce and unblinking, met Razor's repeatedly, each encounter a silent challenge that left the gang leader reeling with both physical pain and the dawning realization that he was facing an opponent unlike any he had encountered before. As the fight reached its zenith, the relentless rain and howling wind seemed to blur the world into a chaotic dance of shadows and flashes of movement. With a final, precise maneuver, Calanthe disarmed Razor, sending his weapon clattering to the ground with a sound that resonated like a death knell. The remaining gang members, now leaderless and disoriented, retreated into the night with desperate glances over their shoulders. Standing in the center of the warehouse doorway, Calanthe surveyed the scene with a measured calm. The adrenaline of combat began to ebb, replaced by a somber reflection on the violence she had just witnessed, and, more importantly, on the injustice that had compelled her to act. In the aftermath, as emergency services and local law enforcement began to arrive at the scene, Calanthe quickly secured the area and documented every detail of the encounter. She retrieved her hidden recorder and reviewed the footage, ensuring that every incriminating word and every undeniable act of aggression would serve as evidence against the gang. The raw, unfiltered reality of the night's events, captured in stark detail, was a powerful counter-narrative to the hatred that had fueled the attack on her home. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the warehouse stood empty and silent, a stark reminder of the dark forces that had once ruled these streets. Calanthe, her uniform damp and streaked with rain and perspiration, remained a solitary figure amid the stillness. Though the scars of the encounter would linger, so too would the unyielding determination that had driven her to confront hate head-on. In that long, relentless night of chaos and courage, Calanthe Monroe had not only defended herself against a band of racists, she had sent a resounding message to every corner of Eastbridge, that hatred would be met with the unbreakable force of resilience, and that justice, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, would always find a way to triumph after the chaos of that fateful night. As dawn broke over Eastbridge and the city began to stir, a profound stillness settled over the scene of the confrontation. In the hours following the warehouse skirmish, Calanthe Monroe worked quickly and silently to secure her evidence and relay the details of the attack to the sympathetic officers who had finally arrived. The air was thick with the heavy scent of rain-soaked concrete and the lingering acrid odor of burning debris, and every echo of distant sirens was a reminder of the violence that had just taken place. Yet, amid the debris of hatred and shattered glass, something unexpected was stirring, a cautious optimism fueled by the undeniable proof that the racist gang's reign of terror was crumbling. In the days that followed, the aftermath of the confrontation rippled through Eastbridge like a tremor, shaking the foundations of a community long accustomed to neglect. Calanthe's daring actions, captured in grainy video footage and detailed reports, soon spread throughout the neighborhood. At first, the reaction was mixed. Some residents were frightened by the raw intensity of what had transpired, while others, many of whom had suffered under the weight of systemic hate, found a spark of hope in her resolute stance against injustice. Local news outlets picked up the story, and headlines soon began to appear that lauded her bravery and questioned the unchecked power of the racist gang. Yet for Calanthe, the battle was far from over. While the police had managed to detain several lower-ranking gang members based on her evidence, the deeper network of hate remained a lurking threat, and she knew that true justice required more than a single act of retribution. Determined to ensure that her community would not be left to endure further acts of cruelty, she began holding discreet meetings with community leaders, local activists, and even a few disillusioned officers. In the back room of the Eastbridge Community Center, its walls adorned with murals of unity and resilience, she organized gatherings where residents could share their stories of suffering and hope. These meetings, filled with hushed voices and tearful confessions, slowly transformed into a forum for collective healing. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence found the courage to speak out, and a sense of solidarity began to take shape. At one such meeting, an elderly woman named Bernadette "Birdie" Carlisle recounted the days when her own family had been targeted by similar acts of hatred. Her voice, though quavering, carried the weight of lived experience. "We were forgotten by those in power for too long," she said softly, "but now, we must stand together to ensure that hate does not win." Her words, simple yet profound, ignited a fire in the hearts of everyone present. Calanthe listened intently, knowing that each story was a brick in the foundation of a new community, a community that would no longer tolerate discrimination. In the midst of these grassroots efforts, Calanthe continued her relentless quest for accountability. With the help of a dedicated journalist named Talia Redmond, whose investigative reports had previously exposed local corruption, she compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing every known act of vandalism, extortion, and violence perpetrated by the gang. Talia's articles, published in regional newspapers and shared widely on social media, lent credibility to Calanthe's mission and galvanized further public outcry. The media coverage forced local law enforcement to adopt a firmer stance, and within weeks, a task force was established to dismantle the deeper network that had long festered in Eastbridge's shadows. Amid the swirl of community activism and law enforcement operations, Calanthe found moments of quiet introspection. Late at night, in the solitude of her safe house, a modest, fortified apartment on the outskirts of the city, she would pore over her meticulously kept journal, rereading entries filled with both the raw pain of her past and the hopeful promises of her future. Each page was a testament to the sacrifices she had made, the secrets of her Delta Force training that had prepared her for this very moment, and the unyielding resolve that had carried her through the darkest of nights. In those moments, the burden of her mission seemed both immense and deeply personal, yet she embraced it with the knowledge that every act of defiance was a step toward reclaiming the dignity of her community. One particularly transformative evening, Calanthe organized a community vigil in the smoldering remains of a once thriving neighborhood park, a place that had also been targeted by the gang. Under a starless sky, hundreds of residents gathered with candles in hand, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of hope and remembrance. Calanthe took to the makeshift stage and, in a voice that resonated with a blend of sorrow and unbreakable spirit, spoke of the need to heal, to forgive, and to rebuild. "We have been wounded by hate," she declared, "but together, we can transform our pain into power. Let our light banish the darkness that has haunted us for too long." Her words, punctuated by the collective silence of a community united in grief and determination, sparked a renewed commitment among the crowd, a promise that, even in the face of cruelty, they would not be defeated. As the vigil drew to a close, and the last of the candles flickered in the gentle night breeze, Calanthe knew that the true revolution was not in the vanquishing of individual perpetrators, but in the transformation of a society that had long allowed hate to fester. Every whispered prayer, every tear shed in that dark park, was a seed planted for a future where empathy and justice reigned supreme. In that charged, reflective period, Calanthe Monroe emerged not just as a warrior against racism, but as a beacon of hope for a community determined to rise from the ashes of its past. Her meticulous gathering of evidence, her secret meetings with local allies, and her heartfelt appeals during community forums had all coalesced into a movement that promised to dismantle systemic hatred and rebuild Eastbridge as a city of resilience, unity, and unyielding compassion. And so, as she stood on the threshold of a new day, the echoes of the storm behind her mingled with the soft hum of collective hope. Calanthe silently vowed that the fight for justice was far from over. Each new day was an opportunity to light a spark in the darkness, and together, with her community by her side, she was determined to see that spark grow into a blazing beacon that could never again be extinguished. As summer's warmth began to blanket Eastbridge, the city itself seemed to rise from the ashes of its painful past. In the months following the dismantling of the racist gang and the community's spirited response to Calanthe Monroe's unwavering stand against hate, a remarkable transformation took shape, a transformation that rippled through every street, every home, and every heart. The charred remains of Calanthe's once beloved home, which had stood as a symbol of both her personal history and the cruelty inflicted upon her, were now being rebuilt with a determination that defied the darkness of that fateful night. Neighbors, activists, and local officials united in a common cause, pooling resources and offering tireless support to restore not only a building but also the dignity and hope of an entire community. In a bustling ceremony held at the newly renovated Eastbridge Community Center, a modern structure that rose proudly where despair once reigned, Calanthe stood before a sea of tearful faces and beaming smiles. Her presence, once marked by quiet resolve in the shadows, now radiated strength and compassion. In her measured, heartfelt speech, she recounted the long, agonizing road from that night of unspeakable loss to the present moment, where each brick laid and every heartfelt donation symbolized a collective triumph over hatred. "We have been wounded," she declared, her voice resonant and unwavering, "but together, we can transform our pain into the power to rebuild, to forgive, and to create a future where every soul is cherished." Her words, filled with both sorrow and a fierce optimism, stirred a palpable energy that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone gathered. The celebration was more than just a dedication ceremony, it was a declaration that Eastbridge was ready to move forward. Local media hailed the event as a turning point, and stories of the community's unity spread far beyond the city limits. Volunteers painted vibrant murals on the walls of the community center, depicting scenes of rebirth, a phoenix soaring against a backdrop of blossoming flowers, families holding hands, and hands reaching out to lift one another. In one particularly moving mural, a figure in a Delta Force uniform, unmistakably reminiscent of Calanthe herself, stood with open arms, symbolizing both protection and renewal. In the days that followed the ceremony, Calanthe devoted herself to further healing her neighborhood. She collaborated with local counselors to launch support groups for victims of hate crimes and spearheaded initiatives to mentor at-risk youth, sharing with them not only her harrowing experiences but also the lessons learned from years of covert training and personal sacrifice. Under her guidance, community workshops were held, focusing on conflict resolution, self-empowerment, and the celebration of diversity. These programs not only helped individuals cope with their trauma but also gradually bridged the divides that had long fractured Eastbridge's social fabric. Amid all the tangible improvements, the rebuilt home that now stood as a beacon of resilience, the thriving community center that served as a hub for hope, and the visible decline of hate-fueled activities, the most profound change occurred within Calanthe herself. Late one evening, as she walked along a tree-lined street and observed the gentle interplay of streetlights and the warm glow emanating from newly renovated homes, she paused to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of that violent night, the years of covert struggles, and the seemingly insurmountable obstacles were now interwoven into a tapestry of strength, compassion, and unyielding purpose. In that quiet moment, she felt a deep gratitude for the support of her community and a renewed commitment to continue the fight against injustice, knowing that the road ahead might still be fraught with challenges, but confident that together, they could overcome any adversity. As summer ripened into a season of possibility, the impact of Calanthe's actions continued to grow. Former adversaries found themselves questioning their own prejudices, and local law enforcement, inspired by her fearless determination, adopted new policies to better protect vulnerable neighborhoods. The city of Eastbridge slowly transformed from a place marked by division and despair into one where hope was nurtured daily by acts of kindness and solidarity. In one final, unforgettable scene, Calanthe stood on the steps of the community center during a twilight gathering, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her journey. The gentle murmur of conversation, interspersed with laughter and soft music, filled the cool evening air. As she looked out at the faces, each one a testament to resilience and the enduring spirit of unity, she knew that this was only the beginning. Her personal transformation had sparked a collective revolution, one that promised to heal not just the wounds of the past, but also to build a future where every person could stand together in the light of a new dawn. In that moment, under the vast expanse of a starlit sky, Calanthe Monroe silently vowed to carry this legacy forward, ensuring that the hard-fought victories of today would pave the way for a tomorrow filled with justice, compassion, and unbreakable hope. In my view, the ending of this story is a triumphant reminder that even the darkest acts of hate can be transformed into powerful catalysts for change. Calanthe's journey, transitioning from a victim of brutal racism to a courageous defender of her community, epitomizes the resilience of the human spirit. The way she channels her pain and past into a mission for justice is both inspiring and deeply moving. It's not merely about reclaiming a home, but about igniting a movement that unites people and fosters healing on a communal level. This ending reminds us that hope can rise from the ashes, and that real strength lies in turning personal tragedy into a beacon of empowerment for everyone.